is solved because if we don't tell you how to think, someone dumber on the internet will. My name is Jay, and our other resident solvers are Amanda, Deon, and Erin, who will offer a greeting now.
Hey there.
Hello.
How's it going?
Collectively, we produce the venerable, indispensable, not to mention award-winning podcast Best of the Left, where humans, that's us, curate progressive media on a chosen topic, creating episodes that are greater than the sum of their parts. On this show, we use those same curation skills to pull together stories and ideas that help us solve some of society's biggest problems. Now, for today, I would say that these days it may feel like we're living in the world of Back to the Future Part 2, where the dumbest, meanest person any of us knows, basically the real world version of Biff Tannen, has used deceitful means to make himself rich and powerful, only to turn the world into, as Wikipedia describes the plot summary of Back to the Future Part 2, a chaotic dystopia. And that feels extremely accurate. But Back to the Future isn't the only parallel, and I'm not even talking about the news, including a lot of talk about wars involving Iran and Israel. It turns out the more you understand about the 80s, the more you will understand about today. And so we are beginning our sojourn to the 80s with the article Donald Trump and the 80s Aesthetic, written in Jacobin. And to me, the title basically encapsulates everything about why I'm happy to forget the 80s personally. If Trump represents the 80s, and he always has, and Trump seems disgusting to me as a human and everything he represents, and he always has. I mean, I was a little bit conscious in the 80s. I'm happy to forget all of that. But the article starts with a description of Hulk Hogan ripping his shirt off at the RNC as a way of calling back to the glory of the 80s for both Trump and the Hulk himself. And all I could think about was how I already thought that Hulk Hogan was dumb when I was 8 years old. Like, I probably should have been the target demographic for all that. And I was already over the 80s in, 1989 or whatever, when I was 7.
That's because you're not a real American, Jay. He fights for the rights of every man.
I was just going to ask if you were a fan of the Hulk, Deon, because you're the only person who might have been.
I didn't understand wrestling as a kid. It did not make sense to me. It looked weird. Everything about it was strange. So, no.
It just went over your head, you mean?
Yeah, I wasn't smart enough. You're not a real American, and I was too dumb to understand the WWF and their complicated politics. And
Gotcha.
What do they call it? Burlesque. Male burlesque.
Right.
Oh, drag.
Drag is probably better.
Which we should give credit to Dropout Smartypants episode for that comparison.
That's right. Thank you. I couldn't remember where we learned that. But yeah, Dropout.tv, Smartypants talked about how wrestling is basically drag for straight dudes.
I think you could leave out basically. I really do.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
No, and I think they did. I mean, Hulk Hogan was already a has-been by the time I became conscious. So I've never, ever understood the appeal or reappeal. I mean, he was doing, reality shows to boost his career when I was conscious. So it's hard for me to see him any other way.
Well, wait till you hear about this guy, Donald Trump, we're about to talk about.
I don't know. I've heard reality stars end up blossoming and having beautiful careers thereafter. Maybe even, presidential candidates / taking actual office.
Yeah.
Well, to whatever degree you're right and not just joking, I think a reality star trying to reinvent themselves is always going to sort of pivot on the nostalgia of their past, right? It's always going to be hearkening back to their glory days, and whatever cachet they have will be people thinking like, oh, I remember that person.
Yeah.
And so this article sort of pivots to an understanding of nostalgia. Like, what is it about the recent past that people gravitate towards so much? And so it describes nostalgia this way. It says, This tendency towards nostalgia for a lost past has been observed in Western societies for millennia, especially when said society is undergoing radical change. And then it gives a bunch of examples going back thousands of years and says this kind of nostalgic yearning expresses a desire to return to simpler times as long held economic, political, and social orthodoxies find themselves under assault. End quote. So it's not surprising that the current nostalgic focus is on the 80s and that we're in a largely nostalgic moment because of macro changes happening around the world and in society. And it just so happens that the 80s themselves were another era of great nostalgia. So it goes on and says, quote, the 80s themselves were a locus of nostalgia feeling about an earlier, simpler America, used to perfection by Reagan's re-election campaign in 1984, end quote. And I hasten to point out that MAGA itself originated as Reagan's 1980 campaign slogan. So the
Right.
hearkening back to a simpler time was a huge part of Reagan, and Trump has cribbed way more from Reagan than I think most people notice or recognize, because Reagan would be run out of today's Republican Party as a rhino. They would hate Reagan today, but he still managed to lay a lot of the groundwork that Trump has used and has taken it in his own direction.
There's this real sense, and reading these articles and then just all the things that are going on. You mentioned Israel, Iran, the connection that some people on the right even are making, that this is Iraq all over again. We're doing the same thing. The manufacturing consent, it just seems exactly like the lies being told to get us in there. And Trump being the newer, worse version of Reagan, we're just stuck in a loop. And I don't know, does it get worse every time we get in this loop? Does the backlash get better every time? Because I've kind of thought of this as training, physical training, strength training. Like you make some gains, you either plateau for a little bit or you go back a little bit and then you go forward. Maybe it's not progress that we're seeing. Maybe it's regress in this kind of back and forth, because this version, I would trade this version of whatever's going on with the Republican Party for the Ronald Reagan version. And I'm old enough to remember not liking Ronald Reagan because my parents and my grandparents hated Ronald Reagan. I don't have a nostalgia for that time. And I'm very aware that a lot of the things that we're going through right now are directly because of that administration and the policies that were brought upon because of it. Are we going to end up in 30 years with someone, me, saying, man, I wish that we had Donald Trump instead of this Barron Trump administration, because Barron is so much
God.
worse than his dad. Is that where we're headed with this?
Oof. Speaking about,
Sorry.
I had a different point. Speaking of being stuck in a loop, have you seen the clip or the compilation of Benjamin Netanyahu and him just making remarks over and over about how close Iran is to nuclear weapons? They're 6 months away. They're right around the corner. And it does feel like we're on a loop. And I absolutely draw those comparisons. But I'll say, unlike some of the other wars, I don't think there's positive nostalgia around Iraq. Now, I'm not saying there aren't warmongers and things like that, but if you go to American citizens, it is widely accepted that was a horrible decision and not good military execution. So I don't think that they're going to be able to tap into it quite the same way. Now, they might get creative. We might get nostalgia for something surrounding it that encourages that perspective to shift. But I think for the actual war, there's not the hunger there. Well, to be determined, though. This is very early commentary.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I guess my response to Deon's thought about the devolution of society is that, I think we're going in both directions at the same time. Way back in the George W. Bush administration, they were already drawing the political cartoon about the evolution of man, but going backward. And it was the devolution of the Republican Party, right? Like going back to people who were in the Republican Party, but we would love to have them as president now. Like, speaking as Democrats, would be like, holy shit, like the Republican Party platform of 1953 or whatever it is, Jim Hightower brought that back, and he like reads it as something that he would love to implement and endorse. And then the catch is that it's from 1953. He frames it as like, look, the Republican Party's stopped being crazy. And so, yeah, like George W. Bush was such a departure. I mean, like Reagan was definitely on the path of like, so what are we doing? We're just going to hire an actor to pretend to be president.
Yeah.
Like, why is that the source of credibility? And then George W. Bush came along and just like, oh, the loser son of a one-term president, that's who just gets to fail upward to be governor of Texas and then president, because we're in this feeling of like, oh, like what could go wrong? And then we found out. Actually, it reminds me of what we're reading these days about the increasing separation between men and women generally, that men are becoming more conservative and more religious, women are becoming less conservative and less religious. And that was the political divide, 20 years ago. So Deon was framing it as like, are we actually going backwards? And it's both. The Republican Party is going backwards. They are getting worse. They are electing representatives who are worse than their previous representatives. People on the left, we are going through those phases of like, whatever, millions of people reading about how to be anti-racist and, taking tentative steps and stumbling and not doing anything perfectly, but like trying to get better. And both of those things are happening.
So what we're going to have is in 30 years, I think we just proved that it is going to be Barron Trump, because it's going to be the fail son of the shitty president.
Yep.
But afterwards, we're going to have a communist utopia. So,
Just be patient is what he's saying.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll just flip back and forth between those two realities. Getting back to the nostalgia of the 80s, this article definitely points out that, it's not just the like simplicity of a bygone era, but the special place that greed held in the psyche of the 80s that makes that decade so special. And it says, but the material aspect of the appeal of the Reagan era of deregulation and greed is good can't be underestimated. And it's a key reason why Trump continuously uses the 1980s in his rally speeches, and why Trump's followers, even the young ones, frequently idealize the period despite the 80s being the origin point for their own material immiseration, end quote.
Yeah.
Which I love. That was like so succinctly summed up. It's like, you don't really remember it. You don't understand that it wasn't the golden era. It was the end of a like pretty okay era where wages stopped rising, where economics pivoted to benefit the rich. It wasn't even sold to people as you should try to be rich and it's good, because the whole greed is good thing came from a movie that was warning people against that, because Gordon Gekko is the bad guy and goes to jail. But the Amanda principle kicked in, which is that any piece of art can be construed and wildly misconstrued depending on where you're coming from. And that's exactly what happened. And so like between Reagan's deregulation and whatever, take those sweaters off and turn your thermostats up and go get rich, the government won't tax you or regulate you in any way, gave people the green light to hyper individualism that we're still living with today. The like, no, fuck your neighbor, get yours. So for those people who like tend in that direction and for whom that's kind of appealing, that is where that nostalgia is coming from. It ends in absolute disaster, but if you don't know that or don't care, then that can feel good for a minute.
I mean, I agree. That was the part of the article that really stood out for me, just that this was the start of things that we are now experiencing the full impact of the 80s and Reagan's absurd, I mean, it was propaganda, city on a hill, but also the most terrifying words are, I'm here from the government, I'm here to help. All of that was this beginning of don't expect anything from your government. They'll only make it worse. And that seeped into the culture in such a deep way. And I feel very much that we are at the culmination of that kind of messaging. And people are confused by what the government does. They don't really know. They always think it's going to be bad. There's no real push to make it work for them better. I mean, we're just starting to talk about that now. Can we make a government that really works for people again? And yet they misplace the blame. They don't see it as capitalist overreach and government deregulation and stripping social safety nets. They see it as we just weren't manly enough. We're not manly enough anymore. Like the answers they hold are so sadly simplistic and don't actually give you the full picture of what's going on. And it's because, I mean, really, like, I don't want to generalize too much, but a lot of Gen X were children in the 80s. When you are a child, we've seen this phenomenon play out so many times before. You think of that time of your life as being wonderful. You don't understand the politics. You don't understand the social challenges. The 80s were rife with challenges. It was not a good, smooth time. I mean, we were just coming off of having the ERA battle. It was still going on in the early 80s, the Equal Rights Amendment, when Phyllis Schlafly was everywhere, and we were having the new Christian right rail against abortion and protest at abortion clinics, and the AIDS crisis was out of control, and Reagan totally ignored it. There was a major war on drugs that devastated communities of color. Environmental protests were happening. Things were not just cool and good. If you were a kid, you probably weren't attuned to all those things. I was 5 by the end of the 80s, so like I was not conscious for this. But if you go back and read about it, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows.
This is where Gen Xer gets to chime in and go on a rant about sports, because that's what the show is really about. The best of the left solved. We're now a sports podcast.
Yeah.
I think Michael Jordan is the epitome of all of this. In a way that
I've heard of him.
That you've definitely heard of him. In the 80s, his first shoe came out, his signature shoe came out in 1985, which is kind of a big deal. It is still he's got a brand with his Jumpman, his little logo. It was in 85. His heyday is probably the 90s, but it started in the 80s. And at the time, as a kid, seeing the Jordan stuff seemed cool. He was in commercials, seemed cool. He was everywhere. There's this constant today in 2025 discussion about how he's better than LeBron, XYZ. That discussion goes on. That is 50% of ESPN's basketball coverage at this point is who's better, LeBron or Michael Jordan. A man who's been retired for 20 years at this point is still a discussion that happens on ESPN. ESPN, as an entity in America, started as sports journalism. They had a bunch of sporting events, but their main show, the Sports Center, was hosted by journalists, first and foremost. They have been replaced by more like reality TV stars and ex-athletes who will always tell you how much better it was back in their day, how much better things were when they were playing, how much tougher they were, how better, specifically basketball. They talk about basketball now as if basketball today is terrible and it was only good in the 90s and the 80s. It was so much tougher. There's a little subgenre in the basketball world of people going back and actually watching those games and seeing that they are not nearly as good as anybody remembers them being. Michael Jordan is definitely a good player. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. However, the talent level is obviously better today because that's how progress works in sports specifically. The athletes are better, the talent's better, they're all more skilled. But there's this nostalgia that is holding the NBA back in a way that I think is holding the country back. Currently, as you guys obviously know, the Oklahoma City Thunder are playing the Indiana Pacers, or that series could be over by the time this podcast comes out. But those are two of the most skilled teams that have ever played basketball in the NBA. And the ratings are terrible. because the NBA does not know how to promote its current sport because it's stuck in this bygone era when Michael Jordan was everything for the league. And well, let's go back and look at what that is. Michael Jordan turned selling out into a good thing because he has sold his name in a way that no one other than maybe Donald Trump has, because Jordan is a brand, just like Trump was a brand. And I think Jordan was more successful at it, honestly. And if we go back and look at the games.
Well, there was more substance behind Jordan's
Sure.
Yeah, that's true.
sellout.
Sure, but he did sell out and turn that into that in and of itself became a goal. Selling yourself as a product. And if you look around America now, how many people are trying to sell themselves as a product, as a brand? And I think that is all directly from Michael Jordan and the 80s and this idea of hyper-individualism that started from there, and it has taken off in a way that I don't know when the end of that is, but there has to be some sort of backlash to that makes selling out a thing again. Like, I'm old enough to remember when selling out was bad, but I'm also old enough to know when selling out became a good thing. I want it to be bad again. I think that'd be good.
So as Deon was talking, I was thinking about, only half jokingly, that I literally stopped watching sports in 1997. That is just true. I was 13 years old and I decided this is a waste of my life. I'm not going to do it anymore. Up to that point, I did watch quite a lot of sports. And the other thing I was thinking as Deon was talking is that Naomi Klein talks about this exact phenomenon in Doppelganger. So I pulled up the quote and it says, in the book, I think she's talking about No Logo. In the book, I explored this new and controversial idea that the insecurity we all felt about the rapid disappearance of stable jobs could be solved if everyone made like Michael Jordan and Oprah and branded up. The management guru Tom Peters laid out in the new rules in a 1997 cover story in Fast Company titled The Brand Called You. Regardless of age, regardless of position, regardless of the business we happen to be in, all of us needs to understand the importance of branding. And it goes on from there. And that article written in 1997 was panned. It was like, what a terrible idea. No one should ever aspire to that. It's horrible advice. It creates the same need for an individual with no capacity to brand themselves or budget to market themselves to somehow do what corporations and superstar billionaires do. Like, what a terrible, stupid idea. And then social media came along to actually help fulfill that desire that was laying dormant for the 10 years between 1997 and 2007, 2010, thereabouts. But I was just going to claim, like, yeah, that's why I stopped watching sports in 1997. I saw the writing on the wall. I could tell, like, we're peaking. It's about to go downhill. All ESPN cares about is nostalgia and looking back. I'm not into that. I'm just going to go play soccer instead.
Such a smart 13-year-old.
13-year-old.
Yeah,
exactly.
Thank you.
Along those lines, there's the sellout side, and there's also the cruelty side, and this ties a little more to the greed is good angle. But it was mentioned in this article about Trump's destruction of the Bonwit Teller building. That's what he turned into Trump Tower in New York City. And I was unaware of what was there before. And I went and looked it up. It's gorgeous. It's a beautiful Art Deco building. Should have been saved as part of the, historic architecture of New York City. Originally, he apparently said he was going to save the statues. There were these gorgeous kind of relief statues on the facade and give them, I think the Metropolitan Museum of Art wanted them to have in his collection. And out of nothing other than cruelty, he had them destroyed. Knowing the museum wanted them, knowing the historic history of the building, he ordered those statues to be basically, turned into dust. And reading that, this is what people say in New York when they talk about Trump. They're like, we already knew who he was, right? This is the kind of guy he was. And all of the things he's doing now are the same. He just is cruel for no reason. The cruelty is the point. He just wants to look like the big man on top. And like that detail just really hit me. And also because I'm like very sad that everything's ugly these days. And so I'm grateful for the historic buildings that have been saved. And so I have a little bee in my bonnet about that in particular. And it's just so callous. And that's the attitude. It's like, why not sell out? Why not be an asshole? Like, you just got to be out for you. That is the ethos of 80s Titans, if you will.
Absolutely, which is sort of a hard pivot away from the type of capitalism that capitalism apologists pretend exists still, but like it kind of did before. You know, when businesses were owned by the founders of the businesses who actually cared about their communities, like obviously not all were like that, but that's the idealized version. Is like, it's great that it's a successful business because look at this great person who's using their success to help their community. And that's what they fantasize capitalism is. And that's only true in the very early days of it. Obviously, the longer you let it run, the more it becomes ruthless and callous. And the 80s was like a great pivot point to, oh, what if we literally only cared about profit and started talking about like shareholder rights as opposed to all the other stakeholders who would be impacted by the role of business. The previous article talked about young people who idealize the 80s, even though they didn't live through it. And so that brings us to the MAGA youth remind me of the 80s and not in a good way. This is in the New York Times. I feel like we should have done a deep dive on Michael J. Fox for this discussion because it's not just Back to the Future that's a little bit instructive. It's also his character, Alex P. Keaton, in the sitcom Family Ties. And the article says, Alex P. Keaton on Family Ties, who horrified his ex-hippie parents with his love of heartless capitalism and harebrained business schemes. This article writer was like a naive conservative person in their youth. And so she says, I didn't see that the show was making fun of him too. The young conservatives of the 80s were all molded in his image and he in theirs. And then goes on to say about today's young conservatives, quote, few of the people I'm talking about were even alive in the 80s, and so they can't understand what it means for Mr. Trump to be stuck in that time, still fighting its battles. Pausing for a moment just to say that maybe it's obvious that this is sort of a follow-on from our previous episode in which it was discussed that, hey, you know, all the culture wars that we're having, if you think about almost literally any one of them, you could look back 20 or 40 years and realize we're still having the same debates now that we had then. And it's kind of largely because Trump is stuck in the 80s and is demanding that all of those old debates get brought up or brought back up. And the article goes on and says, now, instead of renouncing hippie counterculture, they've turned against whatever their generation considers to be woke. The incumbent liberal they detest was Joe Biden instead of Jimmy Carter. Instead of junk bonds, many of them plan to get rich by investing in crypto and trust that this administration will pursue or exceed Reagan levels of deregulation to facilitate it. The parallels keep coming.
I empathize with younger people being nostalgic over this over older people because I do feel like context matters. So to me, when I'm thinking about someone younger than myself, even though I was not alive during the 80s, but younger than myself, looking back to this time, I kind of think about my parents' life and their ability to get, even though union jobs were dwindling, both my parents, at least for a chunk of time during my childhood, belonged to a union, had a union job, had that stability. And a lot of what they sold then me and my siblings was go to college. This too can be your great future. And then like millennials kind of were the generation that were like, yeah, this is not at all what's happening. The economy's not there. The jobs that you promised aren't there. So like we got that firsthand experience. And then I just think it's devolved into that, okay, well, college is bullshit. Like, I can go to college, I can get this degree, but I'm looking around at all these people who've gotten rich very quickly. All they had to do was engage in some kind of callous behavior. So, like, of course, crypto being a get rich quick scheme, like, that jump almost makes sense to me because everything is bullshit. Like, I'm putting myself in a 19 to 23-year-old's mind. But I mean, like, the curtain is off. I do think that they know capitalism is bullshit, but it's still, they bought the image of, well, get yours while you can, because you have to participate in this, whether there's a good future for you or not.
Yeah.
Greed is good.
Yeah.
Crypto is the extremely global and way worse version of the savings and loan scandal in the 80s, though, right? Like, it's just money out of nothing. Like, that's all it is. And people at the top will get rich, and there'll be some people holding the bag. Well, now the bag is huge that people will be holding, and so many more people will be holding it. But that's what it is. It's just a scam. And it's easier to see the success of the people that did the scam in the beginning, or, you know, the people that got on first, or the people with this inside information, because they also get to push their winnings online and social media, and you can see them in their Lamborghini and their McMansions and living their hollow, shallow lives. So it's even easier to see, like, what was that Robin Leach show, the Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous? Well, that's Facebook, TikTok, Instagram. Like, they're all that now. So everything from the 80s is bigger and worse.
Yeah.
By the way, since Greed is Good came back up, I just want to highlight that this article points out, I had probably heard this and forgotten, that the real life Gordon Gekko, this dude, Michael Milken, who did actually go to prison for securities fraud, was a national celebrity at the time. So, like, rich, criminal, celebrity all make sense. And Trump actually pardoned him in 2020.
Yep.
That's a real life thing, like bringing those battles from the 80s back. This is not exactly new for Trump.
I also think, like, Deon talking about the crypto world, like, just made the thought, what's the phenomenon where it's like the gap where you know a little bit, so you think you know everything about something?
Dunning-Kruger?
Yes. So this crypto kind of reminds me of that, because I feel like there's so much information. There's ads of, like, just follow these steps. Like, I'm famous. Look at my track record. I have this platform. I have this money. Look at my cars. You too can have this life. Just follow these steps. And, like, for a 19, 20-year-old who's like, my life isn't going to get better or whatever, maybe I just follow these steps. Like, maybe I too can engage in this. And it's like, oh, you sweet, soft-minded person.
Well, actually, Erin, that's such a good point, because what it does is breed nihilism.
Yeah.
And that's actually part of the sadness of a lot of the Gen X generation, is they were also in a state of nihilism by the time the 90s hit. And grunge music came out of the world is going to burn, so whatever kind of mindset. And it was that there were no prospects, or that the prospects were not good. And, you know, I do see that in the younger generation, just kind of like, I don't know, whatever, man. Like, I just got to survive. And that is sad. That is not where our society should be.
And that is a huge difference between Trump versus Reagan. Because when Reagan was selling his Make America Great Again bullshit, whatever it was, there was a cultural kind of belief in America's goodness that kind of built, and a lot of people fell into, even people who didn't like Reagan started to think, well, America, it is the best country. Like, that was just kind of the default. You could see in Trump's little birthday military parade, when no one actually showed up, those people don't actually believe that. Like, they weren't there for that. They weren't excited about this America that he's selling. What was really clear about that parade was that it was sponsored by Coinbase, that it was sponsored by the UFC, that it was sponsored. America is sponsored now by corporations. And that's what is being sold now. Is, we'll say Make America Great Again. That's not what we mean. We mean get yours.
Yeah.
Follow whatever Coinbase tells you to do to invest in these nonsense cryptocurrency. UFC is now the new WWF. where you get to really watch people beat each other up, like for real. And it is racialized, nationalized. It is them versus us versus them in a way that WWF could never even have imagined. WWE now, but it was WWF back then. So again, bigger and worse.
Yep. Yep.
If only more people living through the 80s watched the 1976 film Network, which predicted all of this.
Favorite movie in the whole world.
No. So the article goes through more examples, parallels with, from the 80s. I mean, Trump is bringing back Star Wars, not the movie, but the boondoggle of a defense idea of space lasers that was originally a Reagan idea. Like for people who didn't live through the 80s, I don't even know if that's getting mentioned enough. They're like, we already had this bad idea and it already failed once. And he's like, great, let's do that again. It was also mentioned, like, no details given, but like Reagan was sort of obsessed about the Panama Canal. Like that didn't come out of nowhere from Trump. That's been buried in his head since the 80s. And then also cutting of USAID mirrors the way Reagan was totally heartless in ignoring the AIDS epidemic, and the cutting of USAID is already impacting AIDS sufferers now. So my takeaway from this article is like the core of both the Reagan and Trump eras, like you can find differences in their approaches, but what is at the core of what they're going for is this focus on material success while totally papering over the inevitable victims. And that's what makes it seem good, is because if you can be heartless and callous enough to ignore the victims, then you can trick a lot of the only semi-informed people who don't realize there are victims, right? Like then it just seems all good. So this writer of the piece, like I mentioned, was a sheltered conservative child in the 80s, and then only later came to have a better understanding of it and says, quote, I can now recognize that there's a cruelty underneath the glitter, an appeal to would-be elites who want to build a world for themselves while putting everyone else in their place, end quote. And it's, she grew up not knowing that people were being victimized in order to create the image of glitter and glamour and success that people like Trump were putting forward. Like you have to crush thousands or millions of people in order to create this elite class who get to present themselves as, look how successful look how successful the country by extension is. And if you just ignore all the victims, then it sounds good. And like, that's totally what, like, it's the same, whether you call it a trap or whatever, like that is the MAGA kids these days for sure. They're focusing on what they think to be cool and glamorous and have no idea. They either know and don't care. I think for a lot of them, they just don't know the damage being done and the victims in the wake of their revelry.
You called them MAGA kids. The author called them MAGA Youth, which I think is very intentional and a throwback to some other group of youth in a different time.
The only other famous group of youth.
I get it. Next up, Mother Jones digs in deep with this article, Trump's Big Fail, Making America the 1980s Again. You can see how this theme just jumped right out at me. And so it begins, gargantuan tax cuts for the well-heeled, draconian cuts in programs for low-income Americans, boondoggle spending for iffy missile defense, and siding with the whites of South Africa, Donald Trump is making America the 1980s again. And on the note of tax cuts, the fantasy of tax cuts paying for themselves with like trickle-down economics also goes back to, in modern times, primarily the Reagan era. And if you ever heard, it's quite old now, but George H.W. Bush in the primaries in 1980 said a very famous line that still kind of echoes. And he was talking about voodoo economics. And he was referring to Reagan's plans for tax cuts and deregulation and the claim that would like magically turn into more money for the country because of trickle down and like increased tax revenue somehow, even though we cut it. And so like he was calling bullshit on it and then became Reagan's vice president.
And then lost an
Interesting.
election because he had to deal with the consequences of the voodoo economics.
Mhm.
Exactly, of course.
No new taxes, read my lips.
Yeah, actually, that's the next piece in this article. So, referring to the big, beautiful bill, the article describes as a tax cut orgy for oligarchs, which is a nice image. It says Trump and his minions on Capitol Hill are trying to revive trickle-down Reaganomics, claiming these tax cuts for plutocrats will juice the economy for all. But supply-side economics has long been discredited. Reagan's embrace of it led to a recession and such large deficits in the early 1980s that even Republicans voted to raise taxes. And President George H.W. Bush, his successor, accepted the reality that taxes had to be hiked up for fiscal sanity, despite his read my lips campaign vow not to increase them, which like largely led to him losing in what would it have been 1992 when Bill Clinton won, running as a 1950s Republican.
Mhm.
And actually, sorry, one more thing, side note about trickle-down economics. I just always like to mention that it doesn't really just go back to Reagan in the 80s. It goes back at least to the 1890s when it was described, I think, disparagingly. I don't think the proponents called it this, but it was described as horse and sparrow economics, where if you feed the horse like an excess amount of oats, then more will pass through the horse and end up on the road for the sparrows to eat more of. So I like to think of that as like horse shit economics or eat shit economics, if you like. And that is effectively what trickle down economics is and always has been.
This article also just outlined the victims, right? The victims that we just talked about who are ignored to make everything look good. And these bills, you know, they go through a lot of iterations and back and forth in the Senate and the House and all of that. And I think people assume that by the time they get passed, like they're going to be okay. Like they're not going to be great, but they're going to be okay. I think a lot of people assume that. And I think they will be wrong to assume that in this case. And some of the details that this article pointed out about the current iteration of the House bill, they're going to take food from children. And I think that we need to say it like that because that is literally what will happen. And if you make less than $51,000 a year, you're going to lose $700 a year in after-tax income. That's a big hit. And I think it just sounds like a bunch of gobbledygook in the news and all this back and forth. And of course, the media focuses on the political gaming instead of the actual details often. And so that's part of the problem. But this is cruelty. And Reagan did similar things in the 80s. He did cruel things through policy in the 80s. And that kind of mentality is back in a big, big way. The thing that gets me all the time is the Republicans who are like, we have a huge deficit. How could we possibly, do any spending because we have such a huge deficit? And meanwhile, Reagan ran up the biggest deficit in history during his administration. And he should be remembered for that. And he didn't do it helping people. He did it in other ways, primarily defense, I believe. So, it's a sick behavior. And trickle-down economics we need to start seeing these ideological views as assaults on people. That's what they are. They are assaults on people.
Well, and I think talking about nostalgia, austerity has been one of those things that has reoccurred, regained popularity. And throughout time, when you look at the times when it's being troped that we have to abide by this, we got to decrease the deficit, things like that. It was always defund social programming, defund things that help people, and increase spending elsewhere. Like, not everyone abided by austerity. That wasn't a general thing. As we're pointing out, like during the 80s, austerity was still a thing.
Yeah, Reagan and Thatcher were buddies.
Yeah.
It
It was being
talk about
strewn
austerity.
about, right? And that is for the country. But then look at all of these wealthy people who are making an insane amount of money during that period, where supposedly that's how we're playing. Government contracts were still going out, also helping these same people. So, like, it is just recycling of the same bullshit over and over. It's just whether we put a new lens to it or if we continue to let those sound bites continue on.
There's another part of this bill that I think is going to start getting more attention. Hopefully it gets enough attention that people will start calling their senators about it. But part of the justification that it won't raise the deficit and the debt, which is a lie. It's just a lie. But
Yeah,
part of the
totally
justification
false.
is that they're opening up 250 million acres of public lands to be sold to private
I
entities.
was gonna
And
bring that up, Deon. Yeah.
and that there is this kind of like anytime they've been asked about it, it's kind of a bullshit excuse that they're going to open it up to building houses and it's going to solve the housing crisis, when the Bureau of Land Management has said plainly that most of the land, you can't build houses on it. It's not suitable for housing. That's part of why it exists the way it does. And that's some of the good things that this country has done in the past, is created this preserve of public lands that everyone can go and see and be a part of. It's like this natural preserve. Like, that's a legacy that this country has that is a very good thing. And because it's a good thing for everyone, this administration wants to get rid of that, partly because these tax cuts that these rich people are going to get, they can spend that money buying land and mining, logging, doing harm to the environment in ways that have never been done before. Most of the land that's going to be sold is in Alaska. And I just backtrack real quick. 250 million acres, just for a reference point, California is 101 million acres. So it is over 2 California's worth of land that they're talking about selling. But most of it's in Alaska, most of Nevada, a lot of California, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. And these are beautiful areas, again, that everyone can see, everyone gets to go to, and it's going to be walled off, and corporations are going to destroy them. And there's no real good justification for this, because it's not going to do any benefit for America. It will benefit some large corporations and their owners. And that's just another, I don't know, bullshit economics is kind of the perfect description to this.
Yeah, and it's an assault because part of the preservation of land is protecting the ecosystems and the watersheds of these areas. And if you open it up, it's complete bullshit that it's for housing. Come on, please. It is for corporations. So you let mining companies in there. The EPA has just recently told everybody to not enforce any of the regulations on oil companies and refineries. So you are going to be assaulted. I think I have to scream this from the rooftops. Like, we are not going to have a good quality of life. Part of it is about public land and being able to go to these places and that it's all of ours. And the other part is it is protected for a reason. It is part of public health.
And I think the conversation about selling government land to private interests brings us perfectly to our final discussion, because it's not just about the aesthetics or the policies and the culture wars of the 80s. It's also about what Trump learned his whole life, but maybe arguably perfected in the 80s. So this article from Current Affairs, Trump is what happens when you give a landlord power. And it says, quote, like his father and grandfather before him, Trump became enormously rich despite doing little actual work. His job, like that of any landlord, was simply to own things and watch the money roll in. He spent decades grabbing as much of other people's wages through rent as he possibly could, cheating the workers who built and maintained his properties, and abusing and harassing any tenant who inconvenienced him. In turn, he's used his ill-gotten riches to become a reality TV star, then a national political figure, and now he's everyone's problem. So, in a very direct sense, it's the real estate industry and landlords as a class who have inflicted him on America. And it goes through all the like really straightforward examples, right? He wants to own Gaza and Greenland, and he treats immigrants like tenants who can be evicted as opposed to people with rights. So it argues that he's in almost every way governing as America's landlord in chief rather than a president who would adhere to laws or constitutional principles and whatnot. So it pulls a couple of quotes. It's talking about Trump wanting to either buy or possibly invade Greenland. He said, as he told interviews in 2022, you take a look at a map. I'm a real estate developer. I look at a corner. I say, I've got to get that store for the building that I'm building, etc. It's not that different. And the article writer says, he's right. It's not that different. And that really is what's at play in so many of these instances. It says, again, quoting the article, on a fundamental level, he's thinking about the world the way he used to think about New York City. Back in the 1980s, Trump liked to buy up buildings like the one at 100 Central Park South, then do everything in his power to bully the rent-controlled tenants into leaving so he could raise prices. In Gaza, he's doing something similar to an entire people. First, he supplies the bombs for Israel to continue blowing Palestinian cities and bodies to bits. Then he promises to rebuild them into shiny new beachfront developments. In Greenland, he won't rule out using military force to get his way. The acquisitiveness common to all landlords who spot a promising new piece of property is the same as ever. So is the total lack of human empathy. Only the scale has changed. So in that context, like all the pieces start to fall into place. I hadn't even thought until we were having this conversation, how much of that federal land is the Trump organization going to buy? Not zero.
Totally.
They'll definitely get first dibs.
Yeah, it's a sell-off. I mean, he's going to the Middle East to make deals that would sell off parts of our country. I mean, he's doing that already with his buddies getting first dibs on contracts. Elon Musk, obviously, being the major one. It's all about the deal. It's not like anyone's surprised that this is how he operates. But are we going to let it happen? Are we going to let the country be basically sold off for pieces? Because that is what's happening, because he doesn't see anything as worth anything other than what he can get for it. And that is hugely detrimental. As we were reading about the Landlord piece, all I'm thinking the whole time is our fucking obsession with ownership. As though that means anything. Really. We've been told this lie that if you own it, you can screw over anyone, you can abuse people, you can be the most ruthless, unethical person, but you own it, so it's okay. You know, like there's this attitude, like that is the pinnacle of being in this world. And Trump embodies that. And so, yeah, sell off the public land. Like I think he also made the case, not just for housing, but, we need the money, is how he made it sound. Like, do we? We're giving a whole lot of money to billionaires, but yeah, let's sell the public land because we're really hurting for cash right now. Like, it's all this grift mentality, and we're sick as a people because we've been living in this perverse world for a very long time. He is sick from the people who raised him and were his biggest influences. And I don't know, it enraged me on a level that just like pops back up again and again. Like, this is who he is, but this is who we are. And that is infuriating and distressing.
So the term landlord is old. It's a feudalism era term, Middle Ages. So this is nostalgia, not for the 80s, 1980s. This is nostalgia for like the 1280s. And selling off 250 million acres of public land, the commons, to little lords and
fiefdoms.
Yeah, just creating their own little fiefdoms everywhere is a throwback to a bygone era that people revolted against because it was horrible. And that's the mentality that allowing landlords to exist was always going to go back to. Allowing landlords to control housing as a commodity instead of it being a necessity and a public good was always going to be here at some point because it was always going to be pushed this way. Donald Trump as an entity, not as a person. I'm not saying this in a please don't send any Secret Service, but Donald Trump should not exist as an entity. Like this real estate mogul thing shouldn't be a thing in a society that works for human beings. There shouldn't be any one person that controls where people live. And until we acknowledge that, until we, as not just the left, but I think the Democratic Party too, acknowledges that there are limitations to neoliberalism. And like what you were saying, Amanda, ownership. This ownership thing is bullshit. Trump can own all this land, but he's still going to die and he won't have it. And like, it's all temporary, right?
It's all temporary.
There's also this like deep fear of death in all of this, like with the way that Trump puts his name everywhere, that he has to be remembered. Like, who cares about that stuff? Once you're gone, you're gone. And all of this ownership and this illusion of power that comes from owning things that everyone can walk on, everyone can see, it creates these tensions that we're dealing with right now. I think it was sent around in our group, and it's starting to trend where Jamel Bowie said something really important about the immigration debate, that he does not care about borders. He does not care if immigrants come over here and work. And we all should start to acknowledge that, because Trump has said this a couple times, especially talking about Canada, is like, oh, those are just imaginary lines. Imagine if we drew the line differently. Yep, you're right. Those lines are imaginary. All of it is bullshit. That's not real. And we have lived in a way that it is real when it totally isn't. It's completely manufactured. It's completely made up. So this ownership thing about land especially, we have to start pushing back on. And that is directly connected to ICE and the Marines and the National Guard in the streets arresting people for existing because they're in private property or on crossed an imaginary border. That's all nonsense, and we have to acknowledge it.
Yeah, ownership and property, all of it's part of the imagined order.
And it was the primary, like, held in the highest esteem by the colonial powers that used the idea of land ownership as the major differentiator between themselves as like elevated and enlightened Europeans and the savages that they would come across. Like, they don't even understand land ownership, so they're clearly not evolved enough. But ownership of land is such a cornerstone of the degradation of society and how people interact with each other. Absolutely.
It's why property owners could vote. I mean, it goes back to, if you own the land we stand on and have some claim to it, then therefore you have more of a voice in our society. And that has not served us well.
Yeah, and ask Native peoples how they feel about the land they stand on, even though they didn't have the concept of land ownership, as though that connection doesn't exist unless there's money involved somehow. Wrapping up about landlords, this article says, quote, Trump is only the biggest and most foul example of the American landlord class, and there are many more like him. Rich, powerful individuals who share his desire to acquire more and more property, pocket more and more money, and crush anyone and anything that gets in their way. If we're going to have a country worth living in, we'll need a politics that is not just anti-Trump, but anti-landlord. And it shines some light on the hope of this turn. It talks about how tenant unions are, I'd heard of rent strikes going back a long ways, but tenant unions is a term that seems new to me in the last several years, and they seem to be on the rise. And so this article does point out that the organizing that is very specifically targeted against landlords is a cause for hope.
Yeah, they specifically mentioned that this is happening globally, that there is a response. And in Australia, there is someone running for Senate on a tenants' right platform. and calling landlords, quote, property hoarders who, quote, take advantage of other people's work. That's a message. Hey, Democrats. Maybe some version of that. I don't know.
I talked on Best of Left just recently from when we're recording about the concept of non-reformist reforms. And it's such a good idea. I want to go into it in a little bit of detail here as well. It's basically the idea of using incremental progressive policies as power building mechanisms to set ourselves up for the next fight. So it's like accepting that it's okay to advocate for a policy that is not fully what we want, as long as it's moving us in a direction that can lead to bigger and better things. And things like the Affordable Care Act are examples of doing it wrong, right? So the progressive idea of giving more people health insurance, good. Doing it in a way that empowers health insurance companies who steadfastly oppose universal health care, bad. That's like pursuing a progressive policy that leads to a dead end, where you are empowering your enemies at the same time as you're making maybe incremental progress against them. But in that discussion of non-reformist reforms, one of the examples was social housing, because it's a progressive idea to give people affordable housing, but it also disempowers landlords at the same time. So that's not a dead end policy. That is a policy that can sort of snowball over time, because landlords are fucking terrible and collectively stand in opposition to progress and like legitimate and affordable ways of living for people and having the right to housing. Disempowering them is a side impact of fully socialized housing that I think we're so not used to even thinking in those terms. You know, like Democrats are so willing and ready to take whatever crumbs of progress they can get, that they're not thinking ahead to the next fight and the one after that and the one after that. Whereas the conservative movement for, 40, 50 years has been thinking in those long-term ways. Like they have been thinking of the nodes of power that they need to take over so that 40 years in the future we'll be in a good place to have the fight we want to have. I think separately, I also talked recently about theories of change on Best of the Left, available wherever you get your podcast. And in theories of change, like there's a series of steps to take. And right after deciding what your goal is, the very next thing you do is map the power dynamics. Who has the power? Who has the leverage? How do we create leverage over the people with power to get what we want as activists or whatever, right? Or elected politicians could map the power dynamics and try to figure out, how do I get my bill passed? Who do I need to talk to? Who do I need to convince, right? And so the left needs to not only map the power dynamics of who needs to be convinced or opposed in a given fight, but we also need to be looking at who needs to be disempowered. How can we pass legislation that is maybe incremental and maybe helps people a little bit in the immediate, but helps set us up long term to have greater power in the future, doing things like disempowering landlords, things like disempowering health insurance companies so that they are weakened in the future so that they can't fight back against a push for universal health care. So that's like the best idea I've come across in quite a long time in terms of organizing strategy. And a lot of progressive policies already naturally overlap with that. So it won't necessarily change what we advocate for, but it can absolutely change how we talk about it, because it's so much more hopeful to argue for something that has immediate and long-term potential to be helpful. So I guess we did it. I guess we solved it. Fuck the 80s and fuck landlords. And the way to do it is long-term, or short-term and long-term. But understanding the dynamics at play, Trump is not just selling off public land to make money for the country. That's the short-term play. They've also got the long-term play of figuring out how to continually enrich the already obscenely wealthy. And that's how we need to map the power dynamics as well, understand who's standing in our way, and like wishing away the wealthy or their ability to influence politics is not getting us anywhere. Taking concrete action to disempower wealthy people who are impacting politics is absolutely the only path forward for any version of left-wing political movements, which is why it's so important, particularly at this moment in time right now, when the Democrats are like soul searching and fighting about how they're going to move forward. And at least half of them are still on board with taking money from billionaires because there are good billionaires. Like, that whole idea needs to be crushed because they are not correct. It's only short-term thinking. You can find a billionaire who will fund Democrats right now, and maybe they'll get elected and maybe can pass some piddling, small change, progressive-ish policies, but they're not going to let you do it in a way that structurally disempowers the entire class of billionaires who are systematically crushing everyone below them. And that's why you can't advocate for some good billionaires, because ultimately they're not going to sign off on the kinds of policies we need to actually turn things around. And so,
because they're robbing you blind.
Because they're robbing us blind, and we got to let them go now.
Well, and I think Arizona was a good lead in to not allowing dark money in the primaries, at least. I know Bernie Sanders and several other candidates are speaking out specifically about the Democrats taking this step. So hopefully we actually see it and it's not just talk. But
yeah, absolutely. And for more on that, listen to the episode of Best of Left that Erin just pulled together. The title is The Fight for Workers, Oligarchy, and its Bipartisan Enablers. Like, the left is in a civil war, and as soon as the progressive wing wins that, we hope, they will immediately go to war against the oligarchs and the opposing party. Because if we don't go in that direction, then it's just oligarchy all the way down. If you have thoughts you want to share, you can send us a message, voicemail, or text at 202-999-3991. You can send an email to j@bestofleft.com or find us on Signal at bestofleft.01. Thanks for listening, and remember that this is all really happening, so continue to be decent, act like what you say and do matters, and do what matters most.